Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my 2023 LCS preseason spring split power rankings video. That is the last time I have that mouthful coming out at the beginning of a video, because this is my 5th and final power rankings video to kick off the spring split. We have done every other major region as well as the NACL. If you guys want to check out any of those videos and also some of the weekly recaps that I have already done on the LPL, you can check that out up in the iCard right now. Those videos are amazing. Obviously, some of them longer than others. Cough, cough, LPL and NACL, but the LCS is going to be a fun one. This is certainly one that I think is pretty wide open. A lot of these teams upgrading this offseason. There were a lot of roster changes. It felt like a lot of teams were going in more than usual. Maybe they weren't spending more money, but perhaps they were fielding better talent. So I'm excited to talk about the league as a whole. But if you are also excited for the LCS video, let me know down in the comments section below. I love to hear you guys' feedback. Of course, these power ranking videos are always a little bit decisive. They're always a little bit back and forth with fans. So if you guys have disagreements and if you have things that you don't agree with me on, if you have some teams that you think are too high, if you have some teams that you think are too low, let me know that down in the comment section below. And of course, as always, be civil. I love having conversations with you guys, but make it constructive. Don't just say you're stupid for X and Y. Kind of give me a reason why you think a team may be listed too high or why you think a team may be listed too low compared to my opinion. But with all that out of the way, it is time to jump into the video. So if you are not familiar with how we do things around here, we're going to be going through all 10 LCS teams from number 10 in my power rankings to number 1, talking about where I think the team could go right, where I think the team could go wrong, and everything in between. All 5 players, everything, yada yada, the whole 9 yards. Just a disclaimer, as I do with all of these videos, not only am I going to be power ranking the teams, but I will also be power ranking the players, and this applies to both the teams and the players. There is always going to be a buffer. So a team that I maybe project in 6th place, don't get too mad that they're in 6th if you have them in 5th. I could very realistically see a team finishing 2 spots above or below wherever they're projecting. If you've got a team in 6th, I could realistically see that team probably being in 3rd or 4th place, or potentially falling out to like 8th place. All of that isn't completely out of the realm of possibility to me. And that's the same with players. If I have a player ranked 10th in their role, I could realistically see them being the 7th or 8th best player in that role. If I have a player ranked 4th, yeah, they might end up being one of the better players in that role come year's end. It's really not that big of a difference, especially here in LCS, between a lot of those numbers. But with those disclaimers out of the way, it is time to jump into the power rankings, starting off with number 10 in my power rankings and kicking off my D tier. If you guys were familiar with my LEC video, you guys know instead of S to F, I did A to D because there were only 10 teams. It is going to be the same here. A is going to be the top tier, D is going to be the bottom. So kicking off our D tier, unfortunately, and coming in at number 10 in my power rankings, it is going to be, to no one's surprise, Immortals. This is a pretty obvious and clear-cut choice for number 10, in my opinion. I'm pretty sure everyone that I have seen make power rankings for the LCS has put Immortals at number 10. There is upside on this team, do not get me wrong. If this team really comes together and plays like the talent level on it can, I think that they could absolutely do better than 10, but so far what a lot of these players have proven in the LCS is basically nothing, and there is a lot of improvement that will need to happen in order for them to kind of reach that upper tier. So let me go ahead and talk about their roster. Their 2023 roster is looking like Revenge in the top lane, Kenvi in the jungle, a Blaze Olive in the mid lane, Tactical at AD carry, and Fleshy at support. Really, really intriguing roster. A lot of young North American talent, which is something that you do want to see, although, you know, some of them have been given quite a few chances at this level. All of them have at some point or another been Academy and or solo queue superstars, with the exception of Fleshy, who's getting imported here from Turkey, who we will talk about in just a bit. But of course, let's go position by position, starting off with Revenge in the top lane. Unfortunately, he's going to come in as my number 10 top laner. That's less indicative of how he can perform in the LCS, because we've seen him be able to have winning games. We've seen him be able to be a big power point on the map for this Immortals team in the past few years. This is more so due to the fact that I think consistency-wise and floor-wise, he probably comes in at the bottom of all of the top laners, and that's kind of going to be a theme. That was a theme with a lot of the other ones, and I think that's maybe a reason I've been getting a few confused comments. I should probably specify that more, is that a lot of these rankings aren't necessarily ceiling rankings, or even really where I think they should be by the end of spring. It's more so, this is the floor of where these players are, and this is the floor of where this team is. Revenge's floor is lower, in my opinion, than any other top laner in the LCS right now, which is fine. Top lane is one of those roles that I think you can get away with that in, and Revenge is far from one of the worst players in the entire league. He absolutely has the potential to win lane. He has the potential to be able to move around on the map, play super aggressive, be good with resources. That's incredibly valuable right now. Outside of Cassante, there really aren't a lot of just standard tanks up on the top side. There's a lot of duelists that really want to fight, and I think Revenge really does fit into that well. I think he's going to be able to play those champions at a pretty decent level. It's just, if he does get into a matchup where he may not be as advantageous, maybe he gets counterpicked in draft, or maybe he's just going against one of the better top laners in the league, he's not someone who typically loses super gracefully. He is pretty often at major deficits if he is not winning his lane. So he's going to come in at number 10 for me, even though I don't really see him as a giant hindrance towards this team. I don't exactly see him as somebody who is pushing this team towards playoffs or top 6 or anything like that. Then you've got Kenvi in the jungle. This is a really interesting story to talk about because Kenvi is one of the prospects that I have hyped up, and pretty much everybody who has followed Academy has hyped up the most over the past few years. He has been fantastic in Academy for 100 Thieves for a very, very long time. Finally got the call up midway through last year in the summer to come to this Immortals team that actually, in my opinion, had some talent around him. You had Power of Evil on this team. You brought in Lost and Ignar, two players that I thought were relatively good. And everything fell apart. Kenvi, quite frankly, was really bad last year. I think you could make a case that Kenvi was the worst player in the LCS last year, at least in terms of a production standpoint. I don't necessarily think it was entirely his fault. I talked about that a lot in the weekly reviews last year. Pretty much everything for this team was exploding. Lost and Ignar were a major problem. Power of Evil just mentally checked out. Revenge was losing lane, etc., etc. This Immortals team failed for a lot of reasons, but we can't pretend like Kenvi wasn't one of them. Now he still has the talent to be one of the more interesting jungle prospects in all of North America. However, he's got to show it at the LCS level at some point. Right now, he's going to come in at number 10 in my rankings because that is where he was last year. And I haven't really seen a lot that leads me to believe that it's going to be a ton different this year. I think a big problem for him last year was that he didn't have good teammates to be able to facilitate a lot of the aggressive plays that he loved making in Academy. I mean, 100 Thieves Academy was always one of the best teams in the league. They were always able to skill check, especially the solo laners. They were always pushed up. They were giving him a lot of space. They were able to help out jungle. That wasn't the case last year, and I'm a little bit worried that that's also not going to be the case this year. So Kenvi comes in at number 10, still worried about that. And they've got a Blaze Olive in the mid lane. Now, again, very similar to Revenge. Blaze Olive comes in at number 10, purely because I believe his floor is probably the lowest, but truthfully, I don't think a Blaze Olive is a bad player. I certainly don't think he's one of these people that definitely doesn't deserve an LCS spot. I think he's played well enough over the course of the last year and a half to at least get an opportunity here on Immortals, maybe over some of the other players that didn't. The problem with the Blaze Olive has always been his inability to play safe. He is a very aggressive player. He's somebody who's always going to try to make plays. Now, I see that personally as a good thing. I talked about this a lot in my weekly reviews last year. Blaze was getting a lot of hate. ABO was getting a ton of hate on Reddit and on Twitter last year because they would be down, Golden Guardians that is, would be down in a lot of these games, and he would go and try to make these game-winning plays and game-saving plays, and he would just die like 1v4 by himself, and people would be like, what is he doing? He looks like a moron. And you do look like a moron when those plays don't work out. But when you're down 5, 6, 7k gold at 15, 20 minutes into the game, you gotta try something. And it really felt like nobody else on Golden Guardians was even wanting to attempt to win the game. It was really just ABO. And so, you know, maybe with more aggressive players around him, Revenge, Kenvi, Tactical, all players that are well known for wanting to go in and wanting to fight, perhaps this could be a good change of scenery for ABO. I'm not exactly sure the talent is there to compete with some of the top mid laners in the region, but he could easily be a top 6 or 7 mid laner. It's all just about kind of getting that form back. I really did like him when him and Licorice were really clicking, I believe, towards the end of 2021, and then 2022 was just kind of a bad year overall, so hopefully he can get a bounce back here. And then the bot lane's very question marky, but pretty high upside considering you're the 10th place team in the power rankings. You got Tactical at AD carry. Obviously, Tactical's stock has plummeted over the past year or so. This is a guy who was on Team Liquid just 2 years ago, replacing Doublelift, coming in winning Rookie of the Year, doing really well at Worlds, having these pop-off moments in playoffs where he gets a massive quadra kill in Kalista. Like, he looked like the next superstar at the AD carry position in North America, and then he goes to TSM last year and everything falls apart. He is the worst AD carry in the league. He's the worst player in the league for the short amount of time that he was actually given LCS time. He goes to Academy and he's only okay there. Yes, he comes back in for playoffs, and honestly, he's okay in playoffs, but still more ups and downs rather than just ups in playoffs. And so, does Tactical have the ability to be one of the better AD carries in the LCS? Absolutely. He's done it before. He has played at a level, 2 years ago where he was a top 2 AD carry in North America. Everything just has fallen apart. I don't know if it's mental. I don't know what it is, but if he can get remotely back to that place that he was a couple of years ago, that's going to be really good. I don't know how much I believe in that. A lot of the ecosystem that was with him on Team Liquid, most notably Core JJ, is gone now, and so I do worry a bit about, his ability to rebound. I just hope that he's not mental boomed into oblivion. Hopefully this shot matters for him and he's going to be able to at least get back to pretty decent form. He doesn't even have to be a top 2 or 3, just maybe a top 6 or 7 AD carry, and that's going to make me, I think, feel a lot better about the situation. And then you bring in Fleshy here at support. He played for Nasser last year in the TCL. Was okay, was interesting with this tape. Him and Balulu I studied a lot, obviously both of them coming over to North America, and then obviously got to watch a lot of Chieftain when he was playing in the LCK as well, and so to kind of watch that team a bit, I thought they were interesting. Honestly, they played really fast and really aggressive. I think him and Tactical could pair up for a pretty interesting combo, but I don't really see them being superstars. Fleshy still has a lot to prove to me. I've been wrong about players coming over from Turkey in the past. Closer is the big one, and so hopefully Fleshy can prove me wrong. Hopefully he can add himself to that list and be another player that comes over from the TCL and just is way better than I'm giving him credit for. I just didn't really see it on tape. Hopefully, maybe he can prove me wrong once he finally gets in there and him and Tactical can actually form a nice bot lane duo. But really looking at Immortals as a whole, it's pretty easy to put them at 10th. While they do have some players that I think have some upside, Kenvi and Tactical in particular, I think if they can really get on the same page and if they can unlock a lot of their potential, that could actually be a really scary duo. I'm just not sure that the floor for this team leaves anything but question marks. There are a lot of players on this team that have really proven nothing at the LCS level, especially recently, and a lot of that is going to have to change if this team wants to be anything but bottom 2, which of course is what you cannot be here in the LCS. You cannot be bottom 2, and so for me, Immortals is going to come in at number 10, and hopefully we can find some of these players turning their careers around as we go out throughout 2023. Moving on now to number 9 in the power rankings. Of course, bottom 2 is a little bit important, not so much for spring, but maybe moving into summer. You certainly don't want to be one of the 2 worst teams in the league, and in my opinion, the bottom 2 are in their own tier. This is going to be the top of D tier, just like 10 for Immortals was pretty clear. Number 9 was also pretty clear for me. I do think that these 2 teams are pretty clearly the 2 worst in the league, in my opinion. So, coming in at number 9 and surprising basically no one, I have TSM, Team Solo Mid, coming in at number 9. This roster just doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in me, although I do like some of the players individually on the team. I'm not exactly sure where the wins are going to come from in a general sense. There's some good, solid players on this team, but none that really stand out and make me think like, oh, this player is going to carry them. I think the loss of some of their players from last year is definitely going to matter. But let's go ahead and go over what their roster is looking like in 2023. In the top lane, it is Solo. In the jungle, it's Boogie. In the mid lane, it's Maple. AD carry is Neo. And support is Chime. Like I said, some really individually talented players on this team, most notably in the jungle and support positions. I really, really do like those players. But as a whole, I'm really just not sure if they're going to be able to keep up with a lot of the other players in the LCS at this level. So let's go ahead and talk about it, starting, of course, with Solo in the top lane. He is one of the 2 players, or 3, I guess, on this team that are returning from TSM last year. Obviously, top mid support, all returning from TSM last year. Solo came up mid-year, replaced Sol, who replaced Huni. Kind of a big top carousel for TSM last year to try and find somebody to stick. And honestly, Solo was pretty solid last year. I had really low expectations for him when he entered the LCS again after, a little bit of a stint in Academy where he was pretty feast or famine. He wasn't exactly that weak side king that I think a lot of people had grown to know him as, but I think he understood his role a tad bit better once he got to the LCS level. He played weak side, he played a ton of Ornn. I mean, a ridiculous amount of Ornn, and he played really well on the champion. I think now with another tank being super broken in the meta in Cassante, I imagine that's going to be a pretty strong idea for TSM, but Solo is what he is at this point. I don't really think that he's going to surprise a ton of people. He is a player that is incredibly solid on that weak side, is incredibly solid as a consistent piece in the top lane. You're not really going to need him to do a lot. You don't need to invest a ton of resources into him. However, he is a really good team fighter. Like, that is something that I think gets overlooked with Solo a lot, where I think a lot of people, especially back in like the FlyQuest days when he was going to Worlds and competing with some of the best tops in the world, people would look at his laning stats and be like, oh, he's really not that good of a laner. And I do kind of agree with that. Like, at a top level, I don't really think he's a great laner, but I think people do underrate how impactful he can be in the late game team fights. Champions like Gangplank actually fit his style relatively well. They can play safe in the early game, not really need a ton of resources. It's kind of hard to dive a Gangplank unless you have like a good setup for it. And then he can do a lot in the late game. He can actually carry games with Gangplank level damage. Renekton, I think he has shown a really good propensity to play late game team fights on. Both of those champions I think are still playable this year, but of course, it's always going to be the tanks. He's going to want to play safe early, going to want to transition that into a macro lead in the late game and play those 5v5 front-to-back team fights relatively well. That's what Solo is, and he's good at that. I understand bringing him back here. Then you bring in Boogie in the jungle. Now, this is an interesting pickup. Obviously, played for Israel last year. One game away from Worlds. I talked about this in my Worlds coverage. That LLA Finals was absolutely ludicrous to watch. Super duper fun, but he was a big reason why that team was in finals in the first place. He was easily the best player on that team, in my opinion, watching the tape, and I think it's a good pickup for TSM. I think he shows a lot of promise that you just weren't going to find from a lot of the other junglers that you probably had as options here in the offseason. He's kind of been around the block. He's been basically everywhere. Obviously, he is Korean, but he's played in the LMS. He's played for Flash Wolves. He's played in the LJL. He's played in the LLA. He's kind of been around the block. One of those players that just kind of took starting spots wherever I think he thought the opportunity was best. That often gives you a lot of different experience playing different styles at different levels, and I think Boogie enters the LCS with a really interesting track record and a really interesting potential to be one of those junglers that actually can kind of break out. I'm not going to compare him to some of the players in the past that entered with relatively unproven track records and had great seasons. Most notably, Closer comes to mind, but I'm not going to compare him to Closer. What I am going to say that it is definitely interesting for Boogie to enter the LCS on a team that really needs this consistent carry threat, someone to take the resources, someone to be able to push the tempo forward for the team, and he's kind of this player who was doing that last year on Astral Esports. So I think overall, I would guess that he is going to be the focal point for this team. I would expect him and Maple to form a really important partnership, and I would expect Maple to take a little bit of a backseat there. And I think Chime, being the hyper-roam-oriented support that he has always been, is going to try and enable that in the same way that he enabled Spica a lot, especially in the playoffs last year. I think that could be a really strong way to win for TSM, and I think if there is an avenue for this team to be better than expected, that's probably it. But Boogie comes in at number 9 just because I think his floor, like I said before, is just a tad bit lower than some of the other junglers in the region. They've shown a lot more already. Like, they've shown a lot more on tape at a major region than someone like Boogie has. I think a lot of it is projection, but he could be a pretty solid jungler. I wouldn't be surprised if he jumped into the top 6, top 7 by the end of the year. Then you're looking at Maple in the mid lane. I've never really been super stoked about Maple here in North America. He's just kind of been fine. He's had some moments where he's had some good games. He has good macro sense, especially towards the back half of games. Has always been a really solid split pusher. I think that's really going to be the avenue that TSM wants to take. That's what he did a lot last year for this team, was kind of pull the other team away when they had a lead. I think the biggest problem that Maple runs into is laning, where he's just simply not all that great of a laner. His stats really aren't all that good, and he kind of can get outclassed, especially now that the mid lane pool has increased, in my opinion, exponentially, even though I still think it's the weakest role in North America. I'm just not super sold on Maple as this big superstar player. I think if he can take more of a supportive role and try to get Boogie ahead, very similar to what he was doing in the playoffs last year for Spica, that's probably TSM's best avenue, but it's not like Maple's inspiring a ton of confidence in me. And then you've got the bot lane here of Neo and Chime. Neo getting a second shot here in North America. Obviously got replaced last year by Spawn midway through the season on Dignitas, and Spawn was quite frankly just better. You can talk about how Spawn wasn't able to bring his team to wins, but it's not like Neo was bringing his team to wins anyways. That Dignitas team was really lacking in talent just in general, and Neo goes down to Academy, not really the same kind of presence for Dignitas Academy, although he does have a good Proving Grounds tournament. Gets another shot here for TSM. I'm not super high on Neo. I think he could prove me wrong, but he's going to come into the year as my number 10 AD carry, the bottom AD carry in my rankings. You want to flip him and Tactical. Tactical had a more overtly bad season last year, but I think Tactical has significantly more upside as a player, where Neo, to me, I would be very surprised if he was anything better than top, 8-ish AD carry in the league, right? I don't think he's going to be a top 5, top 6 AD carry. I just don't think he's really shown that potential at any point in the league. Maybe that one season that he had with Aframu, his rookie season, but I mean, look at what Aphromoo has been able to do. Pretty much every AD carry that plays with Aphromoo looks like a god, whether it's Neo, whether it's Johnson. It doesn't really matter. Whatever young AD carry comes in and gets to play with Aphro looks great. Outside of that, Neo has kind of just been average as a player, and so I'm going into this year kind of expecting him to be average to below average in that AD carry position. And then Chime. Chime's the best player on this team. I gotta say that. I know not a lot of people are going to agree with that, but Chime was phenomenal last year. Him and Spica were the biggest reason this TSM team was overperforming towards the back half of the year. I actually had a ton of faith in TSM towards the second half when I was doing my playoff predictions. You can go back and check out those videos. I called the upset over FlyQuest. I thought that was going to be a really good series and matchup for TSM because Spica and Chime were playing at really just a better level than everybody on FlyQuest was at the time, and I thought they were going to outperform them, and they absolutely did. Chime was a big reason for that. He comes in as my number 6 support in the region. Support was very difficult to rank, and you're going to see a support that a lot of people have very highly ranked below him, and it's going to make some people mad, but I don't want that to undercut what Chime is able to do. I think his ability to roam early on in games and create mismatched numbers anywhere on the map that he really wants to, whether that is in a jungle invade, trying to pressure out with Boogie and trying to get him an advantage, whether that's, 3 or even sometimes 4 manning mid lane, which TSM did at points last year. Just interesting plays, right? Interesting ways to play the game that teams are not necessarily accounting for because of his timers. And I think if you looked at Chime just generally as a player, he would be one of the more comfortable and more stable supports in the league. I think you know what you're going to get. Obviously, hasn't always been perfect at the LCS level, but really does have a playstyle that I think is going to continue to be solid throughout the rest of the year. So looking at TSM as a whole, I like this team. It's not great. I think Chime being your best player at the support position hopefully means you can enable the rest of your team, players like Boogie and Maple and Neo, to be a tad bit better and consistent, more consistent, I should say, but I worry about the ability to carry games. A lot of it, in my opinion, is going to be on this jungle position because I really don't have a ton of faith that Maple and Neo are going to be 2 players that can carry games at an LCS level. Hopefully I'm wrong, but right now, TSM looks like a team with interesting bits of talent to come in above Immortals, but not nearly enough talent to win enough games for me to consider them anywhere near the top 6. Jumping into number 8 now in my power rankings, we start to kind of get to some of these teams that I think do have playoff upside, like top 6 upside if everything kind of clicks, and I could definitely see a world in which things click and they get there. I think that does start here with number 8, and so to represent that, we're going to be kicking it up from the D tier now to the C tier. The difference between D tier and C tier. And the D tier, these are teams that I do think have like decent players and decent upside, but I would be relatively surprised if they were able to make top 6 by the end of spring. It just doesn't seem like it's super likely for them. I don't think they have the same kind of win conditions that the other teams have. Starting in C tier, these are teams that I could absolutely see making top 6. I'm not necessarily going to predict it, but they are teams that I do think could make top 6 if everything goes right. And kicking us off here, coming in at number 8, again, kind of still sticking with chalk and starting off C tier, I have Golden Guardians coming in at number 8. This is a really interesting roster, and I actually do like the changes that they made, although I wish they would have made slightly more, because there are a couple players on this team that I'm just not super stoked about going into 2023. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their 2023 roster is looking like Licorice in the top lane, River in the jungle, Gory in the mid lane, Stixay at AD carry, and Huhi at support. 2 new additions, Gory in the mid lane, Huhi at support, both very good pickups for this Golden Guardians team in my opinion. We will get to them in a bit, but let's go ahead and go in order like I always do here, starting off with Licorice in the top lane. I rank him relatively low here at number 9. He was super up and down over the course of last year. Obviously, really hasn't been the same player ever since leaving Cloud9. That's kind of a story with Cloud9 players, pretty much with the exception of Vulcan. All of these young players that got picked up by Cloud9 could just never perform outside the system. Licorice kind of feels like that. However, he certainly has moments of looking really, really good. I think last year on Golden Guardians, he definitely had a lot of moments in spring where I thought he looked generally underrated over the course of the spring split. It's just summer that completely fell apart for him. He kind of lost a lot of confidence. This Golden Guardians team really fell down the rankings, and they end up barely sneaking into playoffs. They actually do put up a relatively decent performance at the number 8 seed against CLG in playoffs, but just not a good enough team to be able to keep up with a lot of the other teams. And Licorice, his decline was kind of a part of that. Do I think he can get back to kind of the form that we saw on Cloud9? Probably not. Do I think he could get back to the form that we saw in spring, where he was potentially like a top 5-ish top laner in the region? Yes, like tentatively, yes. I do think that is definitely still in there. I think he's got a very aggressive team around him, and I think if he can perhaps play a little bit better as the weak side top laner, which he just did not do well at all in summer. I do think that he can be a little bit more consistent and open up opportunities for him to play a little bit more aggressive throughout the year. It's just the kind of Bew style of if you play aggressive all the time, the enemy knows to be able to target you, and that's kind of what happened last year in the LCS for Licorice. Still a talented player, but someone definitely with some major question marks. Then you've got River in the jungle. River came over midway through last year from Dignitas. They were selling off, trying to miss playoffs actively. I'm not really sure why you would do that, but they brought up XU, and honestly, XU was better, like, over the second half of the split. River just wasn't good in summer. Very similar to Licorice, in my opinion. River obviously had that really big breakout in the lock-in tournament, and then had a pretty decent spring for a Dignitas team that I would say relatively overperformed. Like, they were supposed to be by far the worst team in the league, in my opinion, and they just weren't. They weren't that. I think River really started to struggle as soon as summer came around, though. He was playing really aggressive, kind of that style that River has always played, but he didn't really have the players to back it up on. Dignitas came over to Golden Guardians, and it was kind of a similar problem. Him and Blaze Olive, I actually thought, formed a pretty interesting jungle mid duo in terms of mentality. The problem is they just didn't have the team or really the skill to back it up, and Golden Guardians was losing a lot of games because of it. River is going to have to adjust his playstyle. He's not the carry on this team anymore. We'll talk about Gory in a second, but I think a lot of those resources should and will be going mid lane. It'll be interesting to see if River can adapt to that. And then in mid lane, I'll talk about him right now. Gory's coming over here from PSG Talon. Obviously, this is a player that's been around the block in the past few years. In the last year and a half, he's played for Nongshim and almost qualified for Worlds. He's played for FPX and gotten replaced by Care, who looks really good right now. And then played for PSG Talon and failed to qualify for Worlds again. So not exactly the best track record of team success for players like Gory, but I've always liked him. I remember talking back on the Nongshim days a couple of years ago now. I really liked Gory. I thought he was super underrated as a mid laner in the LCK. Ends up going to the LPL. I had high expectations for him. It just never came to fruition. He really wasn't all that good in the LPL. And then PSG Talon had a lot of problems. He certainly wasn't the only one. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about this super in-depth. We're hearing a lot of rumors about scrim results from Gory and about how he's absolutely destroying everybody. I tweeted this out a couple of weeks ago, I want to say at this point. Scrim results have been known to lie in the past. I'm not saying it's going to lie this time. Gory is a talented player with a pretty big champion pool that is really successful at being able to control the tempo of the game. However, we've heard a lot of scrim gods in the past that just aren't able to show up on stage, and I oftentimes will default to what you have shown at a stage level before I start to believe scrim hype. And so if he comes out in the first couple weeks and really starts to show it, perhaps I'm going to be a little bit more accepting of the fact that, like, oh, he really is, like, super good for this level. But I do need to see it in an LCS stage, you know, at this level, before I just go, like, oh, he's killing scrims. That means Golden Guardians is not going to be the 8th team in the power rankings. He is a solid player. He comes in at number 5 in my power rankings, just below that upper tier of mid laners. I would consider him in that upper tier, just kind of at the bottom of it, if that makes sense. I think he could jump up, though. I mean, again, if these scrim results and these hero plays are being told truthfully, then he could be like a top 1 or 2 mid laner in the region by the end of spring. I want to see it. I want to see it first. He's really talented. I just want to see it. And then you've got the bottom lane here for Golden Guardians. You're reuniting 2 former CLG mainstays here, which obviously I really like. You're bringing Stixxay back here from Golden Guardians last year, who he's coming over from 100 Thieves. Obviously, both of them have played together before on that miraculous 2016 CLG team that made MSI Finals. However, they weren't a bot lane partnership, who he was a mid laner at the time, and so they do have, you know, chemistry and synergy together, but maybe not in this exact form. Let's go ahead and talk about Stixxay here in the bot lane. He's going to be returning from Golden Guardians last year. He's coming in at number 7 in my AD carry rankings, and he offers something a little bit different than a lot of the AD carries that we've talked about already in this video in Tactical and Neo. I have him ranked a little bit higher because I just think his floor is a little bit higher. Now, his upside is not where a player like Tacticals is. His upside really isn't even where a player like Neo's is. He's not this player that is going to dominate lane, that is going to just win you some games on his own, these fantastic team fights. He does need a team around him to be able to propel him forward, but what Stixxay gives you that those other players do not, and I would say a lot of AD carries in North America just do not, is stability and consistency. I really don't think there are a lot of AD carries in this region at this level that aren't going to try and trade their life for kills. This is a very aggressive region for AD carry. Stixxay is not like that. He doesn't really play like that. He is going to go even in lane, or he's going to try to go even in lane. He's going to try to be useful in team fights, and he's going to try to make sure that the rest of the team has the resources to be able to win the game. Now, that's not to say you can't play through bottom lane, because sometimes when he is on some of his better champions, you can, you know, try and push these leads with Stixxay in the bottom lane. Obviously, Ezreal comes to mind. Caitlyn comes to mind. These more poke-oriented champions are obviously the thing that 6A likes to play the most, but he also likes to be a little bit free of those resources. He likes to be able to be in a position where his support can roam with his jungler, can roam to mid lane and try to make plays, and he can just be solid on the bot side, on this quote-unquote weak side. I do think that's a strategy that Golden Guardians is going to want to go to, and I think 6A is basically perfect for that, so I see why they brought him back. And then you bring in Huki here to play support. Always have liked Huki. He had a little bit of a down year last year, as FBI did. I'm going to call it a little bit of a blip on the radar. I think for the most part, they were solid last year. It was just the big games that they weren't necessarily as good in. Talked about this in my LCS offseason video, where I think World's performance has really shifted the narrative of how that bot lane played for 2022 by a large margin. I think for a lot of 2022, they were very consistent, very solid, not necessarily great, but not necessarily bad by any stretch. I think Huki is going to have a nice bounce back here on Golden Guardians, obviously returning to the organization that swapped him over to support in the first place. I still have him as one of the better supports and more consistent supports in the entire region. He's going to come in at number 3 for me, and I think this bot lane is going to be good. I certainly don't see many major weaknesses. I think Huki is a great roamer. That's really been his big strength, in my opinion, although he is good in lane as well. Do not get me wrong. And then really his biggest strength is team fighting. He's always going to be a great engaged team fight player. Obviously, the Leona, the Alistair, that's what comes to mind for Huki in terms of supports, and I think that fits this team relatively well. So where do I think Golden Guardians is going to be sitting by the end of spring? Well, I think they'll be competitive. They have a lot of talent on this team. I really like Gory. I think the upside of him being able to carry this team to some wins is strong, and if him and River can get on the same page, if you're getting close to what you got in spring out of River rather than what you got out of summer, that could actually be a very scary jungle mid duo, and that combo alone makes me more confident in this team than either of the 2 teams we already listed. Add that to the fact that I think bot lane will be incredibly stable, and hopefully Licorice will have a better year, maybe not another one of the worst years of his career like he had in 2022, and I think Golden Guardians definitely has some avenue to contend with some of the teams above them in the power rankings. I just don't know if they have the same kind of stability and consistency that some of the other teams above them have. I think top 7 in the LCS is very, very locked for me, and unfortunately for Golden Guardians, they are just outside of that at number 8. Now we get to move on to our top 7 teams here in the LCS, and this is where it does get a tad bit more complicated. Obviously, the first 3 teams I would say in this list are relatively easy to predict, even if Golden Guardians might overperform in that C tier because of some players that I really do like. I think top 7, at least going into the year, really felt like a bar to cross, especially with all the moves that were made from some of the teams at the top, and so it was kind of difficult finding one to put at the bottom, but for me, coming in at number 7 and kind of right in the middle of C tier, but really also kind of at the top of C tier proper, I have Counter Logic Gaming. I have CLG, and this is going to feel like a big blasphemous statement. I know a lot of people get really mad when I talk low on CLG, and I've seen the comments on some of the other power rankings videos that put this team at 7th, saying it's pretty ludicrous for us to do that because this is a team returning all 5 members from last year, and they just finished 5th in the league, and while I do agree with a lot of those sentiments, let me explain why I think that there is going to be room for some regression for this team. First of all, their 2023 roster is looking like Dokla in the top lane, Contracts in the jungle, Palafox in the mid lane, Luger at AD carry, and Poom at support. Of course, all 5 members returning from CLG last year. Love that idea. Love keeping the synergy, especially with the team that overperformed as much as CLG did compared to their expectations in summer of last year. This was a team that was regularly being able to compete with everyone in the league in the regular season. Now, obviously, I don't think their playoff performance was really all that great. They got kind of crushed by C9, even though the series was close. I think all of their losses weren't all that good. And then they barely scraped by a Golden Guardians team that isn't all that good. And finally, they're put out of their misery. But that's not to take away from what they were able to accomplish. This was a team that was projected to barely make playoffs in the first place. Obviously, a lot of people liked the direction they were going. You can go back and look at my videos from back then. I was really excited that we had a team that was really investing in North American Academy talent in particular, with players like Dokla and Palafox and Luger and Poom, who had all come through the system. Even Contracts had come through the system and had been in the system forever. A team like CLG, a big organization, at least in the past, investing in players like this was a good sign for me. I just wasn't exactly sure 2023 was going to be the year it came together, and I was wrong in that respect. But, again, I think the league just, quite frankly, got a ton better. I don't think there's really any other way to put it. the LCS is so much better this year than it was last year that I think CLG is probably in for some regression. So let's talk about it. Starting with Dokla in the top lane. Love Dokla. Very aggressive top laner. Someone who is going to try to push his advantages. Someone who is going to try to win, the game or the lane for his team. And I like that. I think most of the time he's really successful at it. He's going to come in as my number 6 top laner. That puts him right in this cluster of top laners that I think could beat basically anybody in the region, but not necessarily this top tier that I think we kind of have established, the top 3 in my opinion, over the course of last year. He's really solid, really good. I just don't know if he's necessarily going to be a force that like drives you to be top 4. He's definitely going to be a positive force for a team that is going to want to make top 6. I think Dokla, over the course of last year, was probably the second, maybe the third best player on this team. He certainly had his moments of being the best, but they kind of traded it off throughout the year. I really do like Dokla. I don't want to say anything bad about him. Sometimes he can be a little bit too over-aggressive, but for the most part, he's just a solid player. I think you could say the same thing about Contracts now. Contracts certainly has had his ups and downs in the LCS, and even last year, where he had, in my opinion, probably his best year since the Cloud9 days in the LCS, he definitely still had some downs. But it is worth noting that Contract's aggressive style was really complemented by what CLG wanted to do, and the fact that they were constantly trying to push their lanes to make sure that Contracts was in a good position to be able to justify those invades and to be able to justify those skirmishes around River at like 3 minutes at like level 3 or level 4, right? They wanted to make sure he was in a position to play the style that he felt most comfortable playing, and I think he absolutely executed on that, in my opinion. I just get a little bit worried because Contracts is one of the more feast or famine players in the entire league. When he wins you the game, he looks fantastic, and he looks like an MVP caliber player. When he loses you the game basically by himself, which he did a lot, not just last year, but he's done it on Golden Guardians, he's done it on Evil Geniuses, he's done it on 100 Thieves. Basically, every organization that he's played for, he has lost games at some point. When he does that, you get so mad and you get so frustrated with him. So he's going to come in at number 7 for me. I do think overall he is a positive for this team, especially with how the team plays around him. I just don't know if I can put his ranking any higher than number 7, especially considering how good a lot of the junglers in the LCS this year are. I talked about mid lane kind of being a weaker position. I think jungle is probably the strongest position in the LCS by a considerable margin. It is a fantastic role, and I think Contracts coming in at number 7 kind of shows that off. But then also coming in at number 7 in the mid lane, it is going to be Palafox. Now, this is going to be a criminally low ranking for how he performed last year. I thought Palafox was spectacular last year as a mid laner in the LCS. He was consistently outperforming a lot of the other mid laners that were playing relatively well last year. I think of names like Jensen, that Palafox, in my opinion, was just outperforming. He was just better than. He was carrying games for CLG. He was doing it on Assassins. He was doing it on Control Mages. He just looked like a very versatile and very stable mid laner, I think is the word I'm looking for, last year on CLG. However, mid lane as a position upgraded so much in the offseason. It went from pretty much a dead position, a complete ocean of just dart throws at the role, to, okay, well, now you've brought in a ridiculous amount of talent. You've got players like Vikla, you've got players like Gory, all coming in and vying, even a player like Diplex, all coming in and vying for a spot at the top of these rankings, and I'm just not exactly sure Palafox is going to be on the same level as a lot of those players, so he's going to fall in my rankings. I hope I'm wrong. I love Palafox as a mid laner, and I would love for him to reprove himself as a top 3, top 4 mid laner in the region, kind of like he was last year in summer. I just don't know if I'm necessarily going to predict that out of him. And then you've got the bot lane here. This is where I think I have the most optimism for this team going into 2023. This is the side of the map that I think will continue to be one of the strongest. Luger is really good, and I think he's almost underrated at this point. I have him as the number 4 ADC in North America. He is one of the most talented AD carries. He's actually very consistent. He was a big reason the CLG team was able to weather a storm that they had towards the mid part of the regular season in summer of last year. It's because Luger and Poom, well, I'll get to Poom in a second, but Luger in particular just kind of refused to lay down and die, even when the rest of his team wasn't exactly playing up to snuff, when Contracts was kind of running it in the jungle, when Poom was running it at support. Luger continued to be a big threat towards the back half of games, and he's also a very good laner. I honestly look at Luger as a very complete player at the AD carry position. I think he's kind of the top of this like B plus tier in terms of AD carries. There aren't really a lot of ADCs in the region that I think give you the kind of stability and consistency that a player like Luger gives you. Unfortunately, I think Poom does drag that down just a tad bit. I think when Poom hits, again, he's fantastic. Him and Luger have a great synergy together, and I think their 2v2 in lane is one of the strongest in the entire league by a large margin. The problem is that Poom will have 1 or 2 plays a game where he is just constantly out of position, and he'll get caught. and CLG would be put on the back foot in terms of tempo because of it. Now, could Poom kind of eradicate a lot of those mistakes? He still is very new to the game and very young. Yes, I absolutely think so. And if he can do that, he's going to be a top 6-ish support in the league. There are a lot of really good supports in the league as well. But for now, he's going to come in a little bit lower on those rankings at number 8. I think he's a player that does have the upside to be able to play with Luger and be one of the top, 2 bot lanes in North America. I genuinely do believe that. I just don't know if it's necessarily going to happen this year. Poom just needs to wrangle in some of those crazy mistakes that he was making over the course of last year. So where does that leave CLG for this year? Well, I think they have a lot of consistency. Obviously, a lot of returning members means a lot of synergy. I think early on in the season that typically means that you're going to jump out to some early leads and some early wins early on in the spring split. I don't know how it's going to be as they progress further on, though. I think this team is eventually going to get to a spot where those aggressive plays just aren't working out nearly as much as they were over the beginning part of the season and over last year, and from there, it's going to be how they adjust. Does Contracts adjust? Does Dokla adjust? Does Poom adjust? I have a lot of faith in this mid-ADC duo. It's just about the rest of the team being able to come together and play up to that level. I like CLG as a team, and I love that they were able to retain a lot of these players they invested in last year when they said that they were investing in young talent. I'm just not exactly sure if it's going to be enough to unseat some of the bigger powers that spent a lot of money this offseason. All right, that's going to bring us to our top 6 in my preseason power rankings here, my spring split power rankings. And of course, top 6 is playoffs for spring, and so this is an important mark to hit. I don't really think it's going to shock a lot of people with the top 6 that I have chosen. It seems to be relatively to chalk so far. I think LCS is pretty... I don't have a lot of crazy opinions. I had some crazy opinions about the LEC. I had some crazy opinions about the LCK. I didn't quite have the same when it came to the LCS. But coming in at number 6 here, and personally for me, at the top of C tier, although I think you can more so call it C plus B minus tier, I think that there is a jump between 7 and 6, but there's also a jump between 6 and 5. Whatever you want to call this, C plus B minus tier. I have Dignitas coming in at number 6. I like this Dignitas team. First of all, big credit to this organization. This is an org that finished clearly in 10th last year. They were the 10th best team. It really wasn't all that close. There were times in the regular season they looked like they were overperforming, but they ended up settling into where their talent actually was, which was last place in the league. But you really have a big overhaul, I would say, of your roster and of your organization. This offseason, you bring in some really proven players at this level, and I really like what you're able to do. So, their roster in 2023 is looking like Armut in the top lane, Santorin in the jungle, Jensen in the mid lane, Spawn at AD carry, and Ignar at support. Kind of, we'll talk about that for a bit. Ignar won't be here to start the split. Obviously, visa issues are a big problem for a lot of teams. This is the one that has kind of been announced already. Ignar will not be here for maybe the first 2, maybe the first 3 weeks of the split. Biofrost will be taking his place, and I'll say it right now. I'm not going to talk about Biofrost a ton in this video, but Bio's the better player, and I would like this team more if Bio was starting the whole season. We'll see how he plays. We'll see if that affects anything. I don't think it will, but it is worth noting. So let's go ahead and talk about this roster, starting with Armut in the top lane. Now, people are a lot lower on Armut now in 2023 than they potentially were in like 2022 or 2021 because of his last year. Obviously, he's always been known as potentially like a 3-trick player. The Gnar, the Wukong really are the 2 that come to mind as the 2 champions that he plays at a super high level, but I think he gets a bad rep. I do think he plays a lot of other champions well, especially weak side champions. He's played the Ornn well over the years. I have no doubts that he's going to be able to play something like the Cassante at a relatively decent level. It does fit into his play style really well, so I like Armut joining this team. I do think that maybe you're going to want him to play a little bit more aggressive than he did on Mad Lions in this past year. It really did feel like he was a weakness for Mad Lions all year long, where he was playing on this weak side, but he was being given no help, and he was being given no resources, and the enemy was just diving over and over and over and over again, and he was just kind of doomed, and Mad Lions really struggled because of it. Obviously, you know, they ended up making it work in the regular season because Elyoya is a really good player, but by the time we got to playoffs, it became like a real problem for this roster, and so hopefully you can figure something out here with Dignitas. I don't think that the teams in the LCS are quite as adept at being able to punish mistakes like that, and I don't think Armut's mistakes in lane are going to be nearly as big of a deal in LCS as they were in the LEC, just because I think top laners in the LCS are just worse at laning typically. We don't typically favor high laning-oriented top laners, maybe with the exception of players like Dokla around this level, but still, I think Armut has a lot to prove after having kind of a down year. He's going to come in at number 7. I do think that he is a player that could easily jump up to number 3, or maybe not number 3, maybe number 4, maybe number 5 as the season goes on. He's a very talented player that has shown an ability to carry from the top lane position before, which just not a lot of players at this level have. He just needs to show something closer to 2020 and 2021 than what he had last year. I say that for a lot of players, but that is absolutely true of Arma. Then you get to this jungle mid duo, and I love this jungle mid duo for a team like Dignitas. I think it gives you so many options for how to play the game. You bring in Santorin in the jungle, you bring in Jensen in the mid lane. Santorin comes in as my number 5 jungler. He will not, and I repeat this, he will not be the number 5 jungler by the end of the split. He never is. He is simply never this low. He is always at least a top 3 jungler in the LCS. He certainly was last year on Team Liquid, where I think you could make a huge argument he was the best player on that team. Him and Bjergsen, I think, could fight for that, but I think Santorin certainly has an argument that he was the best player on TL last year. I just don't know which of the top 4 junglers is going to fall out of that upper class. I think all of them are really, really good and really high ceiling players. Santorin is a super high floor player. He's going to give you ridiculous amounts of consistency. He is going to be a great ganking jungler, someone who controls the tempo of the game and allows his teammates to look as good as possible. The one thing that I would worry about with Santorin on this team is you look at Armut, you look at Jensen, you look at Spawn, you're really hoping one of them can step up and be a primary carry for this roster, because Santorin has always been best when he can play around a central primary carry. I'm thinking Power of Evil back on the FlyQuest days. And last year, I'm thinking Bjergsen, where he can play around that mid lane position and really push forward. I'm not exactly sure you have that on Dignitas. Jensen is definitely not the kind of player that those two are in terms of late game team fighting, in terms of wanting to take over in these front-to-back team fights. Jensen a much more supportive mid. Hopefully, Santorin can find something like that in Spawn, which we'll talk about in a bit. But for now, I just think he's an incredibly solid and really, really consistent player to add, and he will make any team better. It doesn't really matter the construction of the team. But then you look at Jensen in the mid lane, he comes in as my number 4 mid laner. Some people might see that as too high. Some people even might see that as too low. He was around this spot, I would say, over the course of summer last year. Obviously, definitely struggled out of the gate for Cloud9. It took him a little bit to ramp up. It took him a little bit to get back into the swing of things. But as soon as Cloud9 found that strategy that they could really capitalize on, putting him on things like the Zillion, putting him on Orianna, putting him on Anivia, these more supportive, control-oriented mid laners that could roam basically whenever they needed him to help Blabber in the jungle, I think he really started to shine. Now, Jensen is the kind of player that can win you games on his own. He just hasn't been that guy in a couple of years. I do still believe he can play this more resource-heavy mid lane style, kind of like he did early on in the Cloud9 days. I just need to see it again. He really hasn't been like that since 2019, 2020 at the very latest. Really, ever since he joined Team Liquid, he's taken more of a backseat, a more supportive role because of the players that he's played around. I think him adopting more of an aggressive style over the course of 2023 would help this team out a lot, and I do think he still has it in him, so I'm going to have him as the number 4 mid laner in the region. And then you've got the bot lane here of Spawn and Ignar, or Spawn and Biofrost. I'll talk about Spawn and Ignar because Bio coming in relatively similar. But Spawn is a player I really like. If you followed my Academy videos from last year, and even my LCS videos once Spawn got called up mid-year, you'll know that I've always been a lot higher, I think, on Spawn than a lot of other people. I thought he was easily a top 2, top 3 AD carry in Academy last year for a Dignitas Academy team that looked really, really good over the course of the year. And I'm really glad this organization likes him enough to give him another shot with a lot of these more established players on the team. I think he will probably pay them off here. I think it will work out. I think he is somebody who you can play towards. I think the only problem that I have with Spawn is that he hasn't necessarily proved it at an LCS level yet. I think he has the mechanics. I think he has the mentality for it. He just needs to show that he can win games in the LCS. He didn't really do that last year on a Dignitas team that was really, really, really struggling, but I have a ton of faith in the talent, and I have a ton of faith in the process to be able to keep him here. So he's going to come in at number 8 in terms of my ADC rankings, but that is easily an 8 that could jump up to, like, I don't know, a 5? Like, he really is that good. Potentially even a 4. Like, if everything clicks for this Dignitas team and they come together kind of like FlyQuest a couple of years ago in 2020. Not necessarily saying I'm expecting that, but you know, Spawn's a good player. I don't want people to doubt him. And then you've got Ignar in the support position. This is, in my opinion, by far the biggest question mark that this team has. Ignar had a really bad year last year on Immortals. Him and Lost look like the worst bot lane in the entire league for most of the year by a large margin. Ignar plays this hyper-aggressive, hyper-roam-oriented style that I just don't think played towards Lost's strengths. I do think that plays towards Spawn's strengths and especially Jensen's strengths, where you can play around the map quite a bit, but I just think I need to see him play a little bit more controlled and a little bit more thoughtful than he did last year. He was just getting caught over and over and over again. The amount of games that it felt like he was losing for Immortals last year because he just wasn't in the right spot was actually staggering. And so you're hoping that those two can get on the same right page, but right now, you know, they could fall anywhere between being one of the bottom two bot lanes in the league or one of the top like 5 or 4 bot lanes in the league. I think both are realistic outcomes for Dignitas here, and I really wouldn't be surprised at either if Ignar had a bounce back year or if Ignar fell right back into the trap that he had for most of last year. Hopefully, you know, if you still have Biofrost in this organization, that can kind of be a little safety net for you to be able to play throughout the mid of spring if Ignar just doesn't come in and play all that well. So what do I think of this Dignitas team overall? Well, like I said, huge credit to this organization for really being able to turn it around in one offseason. Bringing in Santorin, bringing in Jensen, bringing in Arma, bringing in Ignar. These are players that LCS fans know. It immediately adds brand and name recognition to your team, and I think that's going to be huge for them overall. Where do I think it lands them on the Rift? Well, it lands them as a very solid team. I'm a little bit worried about playstyle. Somebody is going to have to become a high resource player on this team. You're hoping that it can be Jensen, but honestly, you're also hoping that it can be Spawn. I'm not exactly sure which one it's going to be, but hopefully one of them can step up and be that, because Santorin's a fantastic secondary player. I think Jensen, when he is given that role, is a fantastic secondary player. I think Armut hopefully can have a bounce-back season. I love what Dignitas is doing, even if it doesn't necessarily pay off in spring, as a lot of people might want it to. Moving on now to our top 5 teams here, and this is where it really starts to get spicy. We talked about Dignitas kind of being that B-, C+ team, kind of right on the ledge of the, you know, the 4 teams we talked about before them, but, you know, still a team that could compete with some of the top 5. I think everybody from here on out is somebody who could legitimately, conceivably win the split here in the LCS spring. So I don't really want to disparage any of them by putting any of them that much lower than the rest. It's going to be kicking off our B tier, and I do think that there is a B tier and an A tier, but B tier and up basically means you can win the split if things go right. I just think less has to go right for teams in the A tier than it does for teams in the B tier. So, kicking off our B tier and coming in at number 5 in my power rankings, it is going to be 100 Thieves. They are going to come in at number 5, and a lot of people are going to see this as pretty low, and I'll talk about why I am high on this team, even though they're number 5, but also why I do think they fall a bit lower than some of the other teams that might be above them that I really do like the construction of. So, looking at their roster in 2023, it's looking like Tenacity in the top lane, Closer in the jungle, Bjergsen in the mid lane, Double Lift at AD carry, and Busio at support. I love what this team is doing, combining a mix of established veterans at an LCS level that have proven that they can play well with young up-and-coming talent that has absolutely destroyed the Academy circuit. I think is a fantastic recipe for success for this 100 Thieves team, and I think all of these players can win the league as a group. I really do think the talent is there. I just worry a bit about playstyle fit in particular with 100 Thieves. And so let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with Tenacity in the top lane. Tenacity is a really, really mechanically talented player, and I think the biggest improvement that leads me to believe that Tenacity is going to be a solid player for 100 Thieves is one of the big concerns I had with him over the past few years, kind of in 2021, going into 2022, was, can he play weak side? Can he learn to not be a super high resource, high carry, high aggression topside? Because there are just times in the LCS where you need to do that, especially when you have big personalities on this team like Closer and like Double Lift, who I think have been very used to getting resources. I think Tenacity looked a lot better playing weak side last year than he had in a lot of other circumstances leading into 2022. That gives me a lot of confidence that hopefully he can enter this team and kind of fit a little bit seamlessly. But let's be honest, Tenacity is a carry player. He's a player that is going to want resources. He's a player that's going to want attention on the side of the map. And honestly, in my opinion, he is your best lane to play for. I don't think 100 Thieves is going to see it that way, but if I was coaching this team, let's play topside. Let's try to get Tenacity rolling. Let's try to get him out of control. Bjergsen's great without resources. Double Lift might not be the same kind of laner that he was before. I need to see it before I truly believe it. Tenacity is one of those players that I think you can really invest in early on in games, and he will pay it out and help you win. I really do think he'll do that at an LCS level. The only reason he comes in at number 5 is because I just need to see it. Again, you've got some titans of the LCS above him. You know, players like Impact, players like Someday, Summit, Fudge, you know, players like that coming in above him. Spoiler alert, those are the players above him, but Tenacity could easily pass all of them in terms of talent level as we go on throughout the year. I just want to see it at this level first. He's really, really talented as a carry player. Hopefully he can continue to prove as a weak side player and fit into this team well. Then you've got Closer in the jungle. He's going to come in at number 4. I think people honestly overrate his 2022 just a tad bit. Closer's a fantastic player, but I do think he had a little bit of a down year last year, at least in terms of the regular season. He really did step it up come playoff time last year, where he was really good. He was really influential in this team making the finals. I wasn't really surprised by that. I actually thought they were going to win the league, but Closer did a really good job of being able to kind of rebound from what was an up and down regular season to make sure that this team was in a good spot. He also played relatively okay at Worlds, and so maybe he can go into 2023 looking better. I just want to be a little bit more cautious when it comes to Closer than maybe some of the three above him that are all really good players, just because I think his 2022 was a little bit more up and down than people give it credit for. Still an incredibly talented player. Another player that has always liked resources, has liked to be a little bit of the carry. You're noticing a little bit of the trend here on 100 Thieves. Tenacity, Closer, Doublelift, all players that I think traditionally have been given a lot of resources on the teams they've played on. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. I think you can get away with 2 of those. Maybe not so much 3. I don't know if Closer is going to be the one to take a back seat. We will definitely see, but talent-wise, he fits into this team really well. Obviously, the one returning member from this main roster last year. Then you bring in the big 2. Bjergsen coming in the mid lane here. I have him as the number 2 mid laner. Now, everybody got on my case all year last year for ranking Bjergsen as the number 1, number 2 mid laner throughout the year in the LCS. People were so mad that I was high on Bjergsen, and I just, for the life of me, don't understand. A lot of times it feels like we're not watching the same game. I get it. Bjergsen's not the most aggressive mid laner in the league. He's not going to be up 30 CS like Chovy or like Knight by 15 minutes, right? It's not really what he does, but I think you could make a really strong argument that there just simply is not a mid laner in the entire league that is as good at playing the 20-minute and beyond team fights, macro game, etc. than Bjergsen. He was so consistent last year at being able to take over, especially these front-to-back 5v5 team fights, that he is easily number 2 for me in the league. I think you could make a case that he is number 1. Now, I actually think he is primed for a bounce-back year, so to speak. I think people are going to get back on board with Bjergsen as the year goes on, because I think he fits into this team a tad bit more than he fit into Team Liquid, where I think it was a lot of more passive players that didn't really want a ton of the resources. Bjergsen kind of was the one who ended up getting a lot of them because he was the best player on the team. And so I think putting him back into a circumstance where he is kind of the supportive player surrounded by a bunch of carries might actually make him look a lot better. It might make his lack of laning dominance look a little bit better, and his teamfight consistency look a little bit better. And so really like Bjergsen's addition to this team. I think he's going to have a great year on 100 Thieves. Where I start to have some question marks, and the reason that this team falls to number 5, in my opinion, is Doublelift. And I know the Doublelift stands are not going to be super happy to hear that. There are a lot of them, and I've had them in my comment section before. It'll be interesting to see if they show up to this video. But he's going to come in as the number 580 carry for me coming into the season. Now, obviously, he's got the talent to be able to outperform that, but this is somebody who hasn't really played a ton of League in the past year. He has been watching it, but hasn't played a ton, at least compared to a lot of the other ADCs at this level. The last time he was in LCS in 2020, he wasn't necessarily dominating the league. He was really carried to an LCS finals, let's be honest, by Bjergsen. He was really bad in those playoffs, getting consistently outplayed by the player he's replacing in FBI. So there is some things to take away. There are a little bit of concerns that come with Doublelift rejoining 100 Thieves here. But he is still Doublelift at the end of the day. He is one of the top 2 players of all time in LCS history, along with his teammate Bjergsen here. He can and probably will ramp up as the season goes on. It's just going to be a little bit concerning for me as we start spring. And remember, this is a spring power rankings to see where Doublelift will land. Again, another concern is that he has always been a very heavy resource player, and I don't necessarily think it is smart to invest in him a ton early. I think Busio, while he is really good at the 2v2 in lane, that is one of his strengths, I think he's a great roamer, and I would love to see him be able to get out on the map and even play for something like topside. That's something that, honestly, 100 Thieves underratedly did well last year, was played towards Someday, who was fantastic. I think we could do and see a very similar play style here from 100 Thieves this year, but you have to have an AD carry that is willing to buy into playing weak side in order to do that. It'll be interesting to see if Doublelift will play like that, or if we're just going to go back to the standard play bot side for Doublelift style that he has kind of played his entire career. Both, I think, can work. However, one does interest me slightly more than the other. Then you have Busio coming in at support. I am super in on Busio. Love him to death. I think him and Ayla both joining the league at the same time is a huge, huge win for the LCS in general. Both of them are transcendent prospects at the support position. We've had so many good supports come through in recent years that I think these two could blow completely out of the water in terms of talent. Spoiler alert, both of them come in at number 4 and 5. Busio comes in at number 5 just because I like Ayla a tad bit more. It's really not a huge difference Busio is phenomenal. I'm just a little bit more concerned about his fit with double lift. Like I said, I think Busio's biggest strength is roaming on the map, being able to create a lot of plays for the rest of his team, and most notably his jungler, and I'm just not entirely sure that's what we're going to get with 100 Thieves. We could be seeing a lot more 2v2s in lane or even 3v3s in the bot lane, which of course Busio is still very good at. I'm just not exactly sure that plays to his strengths. If Busio was number 1 at support by the end of the split, I'm not going to be surprised. He's in a very similar boat to Tenacity. I just want to see it at an LCS level before I put him above some of the best supports that we have ever seen at the LCS level. He could absolutely be right up there, even as early as, 3, 4, 5 weeks into the spring split, but I just want to see it on film before I just hand it to him, right? And so both of them are going to come in at number 5, but they could be a top 2 bot lane in the region. They could also not really click together as a duo, and we could be seeing some changes. Both are relatively interesting possibilities that I think exist. But for 100 Thieves overall, really like this team. Like I said, I do think that there is a world in which they win LCS in spring if Tenacity, Closer pop off. Like, if they are a really strong top jungle duo, I think that's your easiest avenue to being LCS champions in spring. Of course, Busio, I think, is only going to help that. Bjergsen as that supportive mid laner, if Double Lift learns to take that backseat, I think that's their best playstyle. But I could even see a world in which they win playing through bot lane. I just think it's significantly less likely. And so overall for 100 Thieves, I really do like the talent on this team. I'm just a little bit more concerned about the playstyle than I am about some of the teams in the top 4. Moving on to number 4 now, and number 4 is really where things start to get spicy. Obviously, 100 Thieves at 5, certainly a take, but not like a crazy one. I think number 4 also a good take, but not a crazy one. This is going to actually be finishing off my B tier. I think the top 3 teams are all in A tier, but this team is just the last one that I think has a few too many question marks for me to consider them in the same tier as the top 3. So, coming in at number 4 and at the top of B tier for me, it is going to be Team Liquid. I think TL is in a really interesting spot this year. Obviously, the TLCK memes certainly are funny, and they do make a lot of sense with how this team is constructed and the ideology that they want to bring over. However, I kind of like it. I think I've grown a lot on this idea ever since I first heard about it and first talked about it in that LCS offseason analysis video. I think I was relatively critical of the idea behind TL and their offseason when I made that video a couple of months ago, but I think looking at them now, I kind of hope they succeed, because I think the entire point of, importing a lot of the Korean players and, bringing in a lot of Korean staff and, trying to bring that culture over is just the work ethic and trying to make sure that these players are actively pushing each other to be better like they do in the LCK and in the LPL and in these Eastern regions. So the more I thought about it, the more I'm kind of into what this team is doing, but let's kind of talk about why I don't necessarily consider them in the same tier as the top 3. So their roster in 2023 is looking like Summit in the top lane, Pioshik in the jungle, Harry in the mid lane, Yon at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. Some big names, some more unproven names, not to say bad names, but just some more unproven ones to kind of round out the team. I think that there is a lot to like about TL, and I think that they have a pretty high upside if everything works out. But let's go ahead and talk about all these players individually from top to support, starting with Summit in the top lane, obviously returning back to North America, spent half of a year here last year on Cloud9, ended up going to Fun Plus Phoenix, FPX, for the second half of summer in the LPL of last year. And he had his ups and downs over the course of 2022. I thought he was phenomenal over the course of his time on Cloud9. Obviously, had a little bit of a rough playoff series that ended up leaving quite a bit of an impression on a lot of North American fans. But let's not kid ourselves. He was the easy choice for MVP in spring of last year. I mean, it really wasn't even all that close. He was dominating everybody he went up against, and it really just wasn't even all that much of a competition. And so to bring him back here, he still is probably going to be easily the best laner in the position in top lane, and he's still going to be an incredibly strong team fighter. He just is still going to be susceptible to the things that he was susceptible to in spring of last year. I don't think he's changed all that much as a player. I think he still has a relatively small champion pool, and I think he can sometimes get caught being over-aggressive, especially if his jungler is not there to shadow, and we'll get to the jungle. Pioshik is not the type to try and shadow, so Summit definitely has a lot of strengths, does still have a few weaknesses. That's why he is going to come in at number 2 for me. I think it is very reasonable to put him at number 1. I think the consensus is that he is easily the best top laner in the region, and I'm not really going to argue that. Really, I think you want to put him at number 1. I have no major arguments against that. I think his highs are by far the highest of anybody in the league. I am particularly high on one particular player at this position, but you want to put someone at number 1, I'm not going to really fight you on that really at all. He's a fantastic player that gives TL a lot of options. Then you bring in Pioshik in the jungle now. He's obviously coming off of what a lot of people would consider a great year, what I would consider an up and down year as somebody who covered the LCK all of last year. Coming off of a world championship is a pretty good way to end your 2022 season, especially when towards the back half of summer, you were benched. Like, there's really no other way to put it. It wasn't like, oh, they were just testing out other junglers. He was benched for playing bad, and that is just the case. They got to Worlds, DRX that is, the team that Pyosik played for last year, in spite of Pyosik. They benched him, brought Juhan in to play jungle for them in their regional qualifiers, and were able to get to Worlds in the first place because of Juhan instead of Pyosik. And so, while Pyosik played fantastic at the World Championships, we have to remember who he was for a majority of 2022, and that was a very, very up and down player. Very feast or famine. A lot of players like that in the region right now, especially at the top level. Pyosik is definitely one of them. Now, do I think he'll be more consistent at the LCS level? I honestly don't know. I could really see it going both ways. I could see him just being so much better than a lot of the talent that he's playing against, but I could also see his style being a little bit more feast or famine in this region because he doesn't necessarily have the teammates that are going to back him up in the same way. I could really see it going either way, and so for me, Pyosik's going to come in as the number 3 jungler in the region. He has the talent and the experience and the expertise to be number 1. If anybody who has watched this channel for a long period of time knows me, they know that Pyosik, I'm a little bit biased towards, he's my favorite player in the world, not only to watch, but to analyze and just to cheer for. I love Pyosik. Him coming to North America is great, but I, as an analyst, just can't sit here and tell you that he is immediately going to come in and be the best jungler in the league. If he was number 1, again, very similar to Summit, I would not be surprised at all. If you want to put him at number 1, I'm certainly not going to stop you. I just think he's also probably going to have a lot of games this year where he looks like the number 5 or 6 jungler instead of the number 1, and that for me lands him somewhere around 3, where I think there are a lot of good junglers in the LCS right now. So Summit Pyosik, very volatile topside, but an incredibly talented topside. Where you start to get to some more stability, ironically, is going to be from your rookies, starting with Harry here in the mid lane. Now, he's going to come in at number 9 in my rankings, but he is certainly someone who has ridiculous upside. I've always been a little bit lower on Harry than I think a lot of other people have been. I think him and Armeo as a duo in Academy was really, really strong, but I think Armeo doesn't get nearly enough credit for how much he was doing there. Now, you can make your argument that Armeo also had a lot of downsides to the TLA team, but I think for the most part, they made each other better, and I think it'll be interesting to see how Harry adjusts here to the LCS. I still think he's a great prospect, and I think if he shows up and it's just like top 5, top 6, I'm not going to be surprised. Again, some people are going to criticize me for putting Harry at number 9. I think the variance for Harry is a lot higher than this. I just think this is the floor for a player like Harry. I think there is a real chance he comes in and is just more of a supportive, non-carry, non-flashy oriented mid laner in the league, and I just don't think that necessitates putting him above some of the other players at that position that I have ranked just a tad bit higher. But again, his upside is much higher than the players sitting at 8 or 7 or even 6. And so if he ended off spring, or most especially if he ended off summer in the top 5-ish mid laners in the region, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. This is a ranking that I think should get beaten by him. He's just a solid player with decent upside. If not, I don't really think he's going to be a superstar, but I do think he's going to be a good player. Where I think you have a little bit more upside, in my opinion, is going to be Yon at the AD carry position. Now, this is kind of the opposite of Harry for me, where I think a lot of people look at Harry and Yon in similar boats. I'm a little bit lower on Harry. I'm a little bit higher on Yon. I actually think Yon gets a little bit underrated because he got to play with Ayla for the majority of his time on TLA, which is just a blessing. Obviously, getting to play with one of the best supports in the entire region for your entire time developing is going to make you look like a better player. But I think it almost takes away from how good Yon has been generally as a positioner, most notably in lane and in team fights. He is a very consistent player, and I actually think he's going to have a really good rookie split. Out of the two, between Harry and Yon, I think Yon is going to adapt a little bit quicker to the LCS. That would be my expectation. I think pairing him up with Core JJ is only going to help. I mean, imagine going from Ayla and Academy to Core JJ in the LCS. I mean, it is just like an embarrassment of riches for Yon getting to play with some of the best supports in the entire region, just back to back, but that's what you get for being on Team Liquid, and I think Yon's going to be able to take advantage of that. I actually think his transition to the LCS is going to be rather seamless. I like him a lot as a player. And then Core, I think some people are going to be a little critical that I'm putting him at number 1. I do think he had a little bit of a down year in summer of last year, but he really ramped it up over the second half of that split. There were a lot of problems that him and Hansama had, but like I said for Hansama in the G2 review, I expect it was just more of a fit thing than a talent thing. I still have Core as the number 1 support in the region. You want to put him at number 2, you want to put Vulcan at number 1, I completely understand, but for me, I want to see one more season of Core not being number one before I just throw that out, because he's been the number one support for so long. I'm not going to take 1 year, and even 1 year that was still pretty good. I had him in my all-pro selections for support, and just say like, oh, he's no longer the number one support in the region, in my opinion. I think Core is still fantastic. He's still great at every facet of the game, obviously most notably roaming. He basically invented that style here in North America, but also, you know, he's great in the 2v2. I think it's going to help Jan out a lot. I think it's going to help Pioshik out a lot, but of course, there are still question marks for this TL team. I think they are very aggro, very aggressive. If those plays work out, kind of similar to CLG, I think that this team is going to be a top 1 team in the region, right? If Summit and Pioshik they both hit and they're dominating every game, and these aggressive plays that they like to make are just working against teams that really have no way to counter them because their prep isn't as good, then TL should be the best team in the league and they should win Spring. But I do think that it is reasonable to expect players like Summit and Pioshik to have some games where they're just getting countered, and especially against some of the top teams, maybe they're just not able to keep up. If they get behind, they obviously aren't perfect. And so some question marks for TL. It's the reason that they're not coming in the S tier, or the A tier, I should say, in terms of LCS teams. But in terms of talent, I really don't think that there are a lot of teams that can compete on the same level of TL. And I think in terms of outlook, I'm really, really excited about the direction that TL is going in. And I'm really hoping that it works out in order to kind of force the rest of these LCS teams to adopt a more rigorous trading style. That's going to bring us to our top 3 teams now, and man, do these top 3 all have a really solid case for being the best team in the LCS, which is why I have them all now in the A tier. You want to put one of them third, one of them first, one of them second. I don't care which order you put them in. This is the order I have put them in, but really the difference between these 3 teams is minuscule at best. All of them could be the best team in the league, and I would not be surprised at all. But for me, coming in at number 3 in my power rankings, and surprising a few people, it is going to be FlyQuest. I have them coming in at number 3, being a little bit cautious to start the year, if only because sometimes some of these players come over and aren't good immediately. That has kind of been a trend that we have seen in terms of LCK players coming to North America, is sometimes it does take a little bit of time for them to ingratiate. However, talent-wise, this is the most talented team in the league, and it's by a large margin. I do have some question marks, which I will get to, but for the most part, holy crap, did FlyQuest have the best offseason a North American team has ever had? I mean, maybe you can think of TL in 2018, but outside of that, I don't think an NA team has ever had as good of an offseason as FlyQuest had this year. So let's go ahead and talk about what their 2023 offseason looked like as we talk about their team. It looked like Impact in the top lane, Spica in the jungle, Vikla in the mid lane, Prince at AD carry, and Ayla at support. Of course, some visa issues. It looks like Ayla won't be here to start the year. Winsom's going to be playing. That's fine. I honestly think that will help ingratiate Vikla and Prince a tad bit more, with Winsome being Korean and playing in, Korea. I think that's going to help players that maybe speak primarily Korean ingratiate themselves into the team. Obviously, Impact being here is going to help. It'll just be Spica on opening day, but that's okay. I still think this team has a ridiculous amount of talent that even if they're not able to communicate once everybody comes in, I still think they are going to be just fine. So let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with the top lane and Impact. And honestly, it's going to sound weird, but Impact is one of the parts of this team that I'm a little concerned about. I thought Impact had an underratedly bad year last year. Nobody was really talking about it. People weren't saying that Impact was having kind of that bad year, but to me, he was very similar to Arma last year, and honestly, I didn't really see a big difference between how they played. I think Impact proved kind of what he has turned into over the past 3 years. It's just kind of been slowly getting here, and what that was for Impact in 2022 was maybe the worst laner in the league. He was not very good in the first 10 minutes of the game in top lane. He was consistently dying, throwing away leads, but he was able to rebound a lot of that by just playing team fights fantastically. That's kind of what Impact was, especially towards the back half of the year and going into playoffs, where it was okay, he's down 20 CS and 2 kills, but his gangplank in these team fights is so ridiculously good that it almost justifies him not winning lane. That's kind of where Impact landed last year. Hopefully he can get back to being a little bit more stable on that top side as we've kind of known him, rather than being kind of this feast or famine player that just loses early and wins late. I still think that's going to be positive for the team, even if he gets there. I don't think he's going to be that this year. I think with the players around him that he has, he's going to be a tad bit more consistent. That Evil Geniuses team was so aggressive last year. I think it honestly rubbed off on impact, and I don't think that will happen with this FlyQuest team. I have him as my number 4 top laner. I think it might be a little high for how he performed last year. I think obviously a player like Tenacity could absolutely jump him as the year goes on, but for now, his consistency and just how he has played over the course of his career, he's never been on a team that has been even remotely not good. I mean, I can even think back to like the Impulse and like I believe he was on NRG days, like back in the day. He made those teams so much better, and I think that, you know, that's indicative of just how consistent he is. Then you get to Spica in the jungle. He's going to be ranked the lowest of anybody on this team at number 6, but that has more to do with how good the jungle position is than what I think of Spica. I honestly think Spica was a little bit underrated last year. A lot of people were looking at TSM as a disaster team, and they were right. TSM was a disaster team, but Spica was trying his absolute best to save a lot of those games. He made some mistakes. He was a little bit over-aggressive, but like I said with some of the other players in the LCS countdown, I would much rather see a player on a bad team try and win the game than a player on a bad team roll over and die. And Spica was trying to win games, and it ended up working once Chime came in, and they really were able to solidify a nice partnership between jungle and support. I think that helped out Spica a lot, and they were able to win some series in the playoffs against this FlyQuest team that people just were not expecting. I think that was really positive overall for Spica, and I think that bodes well for 2023. I still think there is an MVP caliber player in Spica's body. It's hard for me to put him above anybody that was in that top 5. All of those players in the top 5, I mean, who am I going to put him above? Santorin? Well, Santorin was just better than him last year. Closer? Well, Closer's just better than him, right? Like, jungle in the LCS is just so strong that unfortunately Spica falls to 6. I still think he's a ridiculously good player, though, and a huge addition for this FlyQuest team. And then you get to the 2 imports. We got to talk about him now, starting with Vikla. He is going to come in as my number 1 mid laner in the region. However, I am a little bit lower on Vikla than I think other people are. I do think he absolutely helped KT Rolster come in last year and become a lot more consistent as a team. He gave, players like Aiming the opportunity to break out a bit more, to play more aggressive because of the stability that he offered in the mid lane. I, however, think he was a little bit overrated by LCK analysts for the most part. He was really, really good, but I don't think he had superstar LCK potential. Now, does that mean he's not the best mid laner coming over to North America? No, I do think he is the best mid laner coming over to North America. I think that the talent level that he showed in the LCK last year shows me that from a consistency standpoint, especially in a role that is as weak as mid lane is in North America. There just isn't going to be a lot of players that are going to be able to touch him in that regard. But he's not his superstar. Like, we have seen some unreal players. I'm going to compare him with Prince a little bit here. Prince is a superstar. He's somebody who dominated in the LCK, was someone who was really strong as a carry player, and I expect to come over and pick up right where he left off in North America. That's not who Vikla is. He's not this carry-oriented, dominant superstar level player that's going to come in and just destroy the league. He's that much better than everybody. He is a very good mid laner, but he is not leaps and bounds better than everybody in the league. Very, very great pickup for FlyQuest, especially with a player that is so young. To be able to get them over here to North America is very similar to Berserker, in my opinion, last year. I like Berserker a bit more as a prospect than Vikla, but still a very, very good pickup for FlyQuest, and it's even better because you are able to bring in Prince in the bottom lane, who was second in MVP voting in the LCK last year. Not only in actual voting, but in my voting as well. He was so good that he almost carried Live Sandbox basically by himself to Worlds. They should have been 4th as the 4th seed, but DRX was able to beat them. Obviously, DRX goes on to win the World Championships. I'm not saying Sandbox would have done that, but it is worth noting Prince was stellar last year, and honestly, if he's even remotely like that for FlyQuest this year, this team is no-brainer top 1 in the league. Like, if we get the actual version of Prince that we got in the LCK, he is easy MVP. This team is easy number 1. They're actually making a dent at MSI. Like, that's the kind of upside that this FlyQuest team has if Prince is the player that we think he is. However, it really was a breakout year for Prince, and I don't want to say that regression is in order, but we have to remember this is a player that had been given chances in the LCK before, most notably on Damwon, where he just wasn't really the player that they were looking for, ends up being replaced by Ghost, and that's really when Damwon exploded. And so it'll be interesting to see if last year's form is the real Prince, or if it was just lightning in a bottle, a great circumstance with a team that was really willing to invest in him Hopefully, we're getting the best version of Prince here for FlyQuest in 2023, but there is definitely a chance that he does regress a tad bit, or alternatively, that he just isn't as good at the start, that maybe it takes him a bit of time to ingratiate himself here in North America. We definitely have seen that from players as well. But then you talked about Ayla at support. Just talked about Busio a couple of rankings ago. Let's talk about Ayla now. I have him one spot above Busio. Some people are going to put Busio above Ayla. I don't think either is wrong. Both are ridiculously talented support prospects, but to me, Ayla is the best prospect to ever come out of Academy. Yes, that includes, Jojo Pune. Yes, that includes Blabber, in my opinion, if you want to count him. Yes, in my opinion, that includes Tenacity. Like all these other players, Busio is included there. There is no one who has just shown to me that they will be dominant at this level quite like Ayla. I would be incredibly surprised if he is not immediately a top 1 or 2 support by the time this split ends. I think he could be the best support in North America in the first week or 2. He really is that good. Obviously, he's not going to play the first week of the season, but when you're looking at the upside of a bot lane like Prince and Ayla, they could dominate in North America and actually be an international threat. That's how talented these two are. If Ayla comes in and is just ridiculously good, I'm not going to be surprised even a little bit. I think it's really only a matter of time before he surpasses players like Core and players like Vulcan for being the best support in North America. He should be the next superstar MVP candidate for many, many years coming out of the North American system. And pairing that with a player who just almost won the LCK MVP, I mean, that really just could be the best bot lane North America has ever seen. But there are question marks. Like I said, a little bit lower on Impact, a little bit lower on Vikla. Spica's got to bounce back. There are some things that I do need to see before just crowning FlyQuest as the best team in the league, but they really should be. Like, they really have no reason not to be the #1 team in North America. When you look at the talent list of what they have here, they really should, by all accounts and for all intents and purposes, be the best team in NA. I just need to see it on paper. If they are the best team by week 1, I'm going to be ready to crown them. Trust me, I'm not going to be hesitant to pull the trigger. It's just preseason. I have a few hiccups that I think some other analysts don't have, and so for me, they're going to come in at number 3 instead of the easy pick for number 1. That brings us to our final 2 teams here in the power rankings. Obviously, by revealing number 2 here, I will be revealing number 1 as well, but we'll talk about number 2 first. So, coming in very closely at number 2, and like I said, any of these top 3 can go in any order, but coming in for me at number 2 to start the year, I have the reigning LCS champions, Cloud9. I have Cloud9 coming in at number 2, midway through the A tier. Really like their roster, obviously retaining 4 of the 5 members that just won you LCS in summer, but making a pretty interesting change in the mid lane that I'll talk about, maybe not being nearly as down on as some of the other analysts. So, their 2023 roster is looking like Fudge in the top lane, Blabber in the jungle, Diplex in the mid lane, Berserker at AD carry, and Sven at support. These numbers are all over the place, so let's go ahead and jump into it before, you guys all comment so I can give my explanation, starting with Fudge in the top lane. I have him as number 3 in terms of top laners. I think that's about where he is going to land. I think for a lot of last year, you could consider him number 2. In the playoffs, I think you could consider him number 1. Then at Worlds, he was kind of up and down. I think 3 is right around the spot for him. He's going to play really aggressive. He's going to be able to win when he gets these counter matchups, which is what Cloud9 was really invested in giving him a lot of the end of last year, especially in the playoffs. They wanted to get red side and they wanted to save that counter pick for top lane. I actually think this is a great meta to do that in. Fudge is one of those players that really can just win a lot of matchups. Now, it wasn't great at Worlds. I know a lot of people are a little bit jaded, I would say, from his Worlds performance, but he still is a ridiculously mechanically talented player. He fits in with the rest of these players incredibly well, most specifically Blabber, who I think he's really developed a solid chemistry with. I don't think it's to the same level as some of the other players on the team, but him and Blabber, I think, do play together relatively well, and I think Fudge knows when he can and cannot play aggressive. He's not worried about playing weak side, but he can just straight up win you games by himself, especially here at an LCS level, and so Fudge comes in as one of the more interesting top laners in the entire league, a player that at times is going to look like number 1, and at other times it's going to look, closer to around 3 or 4, but I don't think he goes ever too much lower than this. He's always going to be a huge positive for the C9 team, and talking about huge positives, Let's talk about Blabber. I'm notoriously high on him. I've always been high on him. I've had him as the #1 jungler in the region for years and years and years and years. A lot of people are going to want to see Inspired at this #1 spot because he just won the MVP. But let me say it, Blabber's playoff run reminded everybody that Blabber is the best jungler in the league. He is just simply the most talented player that we have. I don't even think it's really all that close. Blabber is one of those players that just changes games for being in it. You have to know where he is at all times or else he is going to make you pay. You have to devote a ridiculous amount of resources to stopping his plays rather than creating your own, and I think that's what separates Blabber from pretty much every other jungler at an LCS level. He plays so aggressive and so fast-paced and so crazy that oftentimes teams just aren't able to keep up, and he's able to win games basically on the spot. I think when you're looking at players that just can win the LCS, like, as the best player, and it's really not all that close, I think Blabber jumps out to that. Blabber's one of the first people that I think of in that respect. Obviously, they've got another player kind of similar to that on this team, and we'll get to that in a bit, but Blabber is just one of those players that will win you the game if you do not respect him, and so huge ups to Blabber. You want to put him at #2, sure, but for me, he's going to come in as the #1 jungler in the region and arguably the best endemic North American player of all time, maybe outside of Doublelift, right? He's right up in that category for me now with that summer championship. And then looking at Diplex in the mid lane, this is where it starts to get a little bit more intriguing. Obviously, Diplex, a very interesting player on Vitality B last year. They had a very interesting roster. Those solo laners were super strong. Zagenda and Diplex were really just dominating a lot of the lower competition, I would say, that they had to play before they got to EU Masters. Once they kind of got there, it really started to get a little bit more, up in the air. I think they ran into some teams that weren't necessarily quite as big of pushovers. I still think Diplex is a really solid player, though. Cloud9 has a ridiculously good track record of finding these players in, the EU Masters scene or, just in the NA ecosystem and promoting them and having a ton of confidence in them and having them work out. I'm not really concerned that Diplex won't be another one of them. I have him ranked a little bit hesitantly at #6. He's above some players that I do like. Players like Palafox, he's actually coming in above. Even a player like Harry, I think you can make a real case is a bigger prospect than Diplex. But after watching the tape, I think I saw enough to feel comfortable putting him at #6, especially with a team like Cloud9 believing so much in him. I think he is going to play well. It'll be interesting to see if he adopts a style similar to what Jensen was doing towards the back half of last year. Like I said, Jensen was playing more of that supportive style. A lot of picks like Zillion, like Orianna, that were really there to enable Blabber to be able to play his Olaf and his Kindred and, these more aggressive picks that they wanted to see out of the jungle. And so it'll be interesting to see if Diplex kind of moves to that style. He was a more carry-oriented mid laner, a more resource-oriented mid laner in the EU Masters tournament that I watched, and so it'll be interesting to see if he adapts or if they want to go to a more carry-oriented mid-style, similar to what they had in spring with Fudge, who was playing more carry-oriented mid laners, or at least more resource-oriented mid laners. So I think both can work. I think Diplex is a really solid player, and I think he fits into this team relatively well. And then you get to the bot lane, you're going to be looking at these numbers and seeing a big disparity, but I think for the most part, I'll explain that as we go through. We'll start with Berserker, coming in as the #2 AD carry in the region. He was the #1 AD carry in the region last year, maybe outside of Danny, but even then, I still think Berserker's upside and his mechanical talent just was unparalleled. Berserker was that dude for Cloud9 throughout all of last year, and he definitely proved that in the playoffs. I mean, he was dominant, especially in that Zeri, Sivir, Yuumi, Lucian meta, where he could just play these really aggressive picks and be the big strong side in the 2v2 bot lane. I think that was huge for Berserker, and it really allowed him to show his mechanical superiority over a lot of the other players in the league. Now, obviously, Prince coming in knocks him down one spot, but he's still going to be ridiculously talented. I have him and Prince as like this big gap between them and pretty much anybody else at those positions in the league. I like some of the players at 3, 4, 5, FBI, Luger, Doublelift. I think they're good players, right? But Berserker and Prince, to me, stand alone as the top 2 AD carries. To have a player like that on your roster also pretty much makes you an immediate title contender, in my opinion. To have both him and Blabber at arguably the 2 most important positions in the region and in the world right now, I mean, that's awesome. Like, that's about as good as it gets for Cloud9. That's the reason they come in at #2 for me in the power rankings. But then we get to talk about Sven. Now, you're going to look at the #7 and say that's way too low for Sven, and he will absolutely outperform this ranking. However, I think individually, independently of his partnership with Berserker, he probably is around #7. He is a player that is relatively limited in what he can play. He has shown a great propensity on enchanters, but he has definitely had his problems on engagers, especially ones not named Alistair. I don't think he plays any engagers not named Alistair, at least at a high level. His Leona was just bad last year. There's no other way to put it. I think his pairing with Berserker obviously makes him a lot better. Berserker can do a lot of the heavy lifting, but Sven's playstyle is very clear. You know exactly what he is going to do at the support position. He's not going to roam. He's not going to play with this jungle. He is going to play for the 2v2, and Cloud9 plays that really well. They create overloads on the top side of the map, having Blabber push forward, fighting for Crab, having the mid lane roam up, having Fudge push as fast as possible instead of trying to freeze the wave in top lane, and then they have this isolated 2v2 that they feel confident that they can win, 9 times out of 10 because of the talent level that this bot lane has. I think that is a very strong way to win games. It'll be interesting to see if they can pull the same thing off as we go throughout 2023, because I do think Diplex does add an interesting wrinkle into that game plan, but for the most part, I think with the personnel you have here, it still works. Sven being this more 2v2 minded support, someone that wants to play Lulu, someone that wants to play Yuumi, someone that wants to play Nami, those champions, I think does work. It allows Berserker to play really aggressive in that 2v2, look for those 2v2 kills, not worry too much about jungle pressure because Blabber's going to be taking advantage of it on the top side. I think the Cloud9 ecosystem really facilitates how this bot lane likes to play, and I think it'll make Sven look a lot better than number 7, but I think just looking at him individually as a player, that's about where I rank him. So why does Cloud9 come in at number 2 over FlyQuest? Well, again, I think it's just consistency. They have such a clear path to winning games. If they just play the exact same style that they did last year, I really don't see a lot of teams being able to deal with it in that same way. Obviously, I think all of the top 3 teams can probably compete with Cloud9, but I think Cloud9 maybe has an easier time beating up on some of the lower teams in the league because of the consistency that they're able to offer. Blabber is going to brutalize bad junglers. Berserker is going to brutalize bad AD carries and bad supports. Fudge is really, really good against bad top laners. Even if Diplex and Sven aren't superstars like some of the other players that we're seeing in those roles on a team like FlyQuest are, I still think Cloud9 is going to be a team that pretty consistently rolls to top 3, and in my opinion, top 2 as the spring split moves on. That's going to bring us to our final team, my number 1 team in my LCS power rankings, and those of you who know the LCS teams know who's left. There is only 1 team remaining, so I won't keep you in suspense too long. My prediction for the winner of Spring Split 2023 in the LCS is Evil Geniuses. EG, I do think, is going to be the best team in 2023 in the LCS, or at least that's my prediction to start the year. Now, I think that there are a lot of compounding factors here. I think the fact that you're bringing back the best jungle mid duo in the league, at least last year, is a pretty good start. You're arguably bringing back the best support in the league. That's a pretty good start. Now you're losing top and you're losing ADC, and ADC was really strong for you, at least over the course of the regular season, but I think both replacements are incredibly strong and at times could be considered upgrades in certain areas. So let's go ahead and talk about what their 2023 roster is looking like. In the top lane, it is Someday. In the jungle, it's Inspired. In the mid lane, it's Jojo Pune. At AD carry, it's FBI. And support is Vulcan. Love this roster. Genuinely love this roster. The reason they come in at number 1 is it just feels so complete. It feels like Evil Geniuses had a strong case to be called the best team in North America last year. They were the best team in the regular season. They couldn't quite get it done in playoffs on a meta that didn't super suit them, but they were able to take down Mad Lions at Worlds. They were able to take a game off of G2. They just looked really, really solid. And I think they only got better in the offseason, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and talk about why I think that's, starting with one of the changes in the top lane here with Someday coming in to replace Impact. And honestly, to me, this is just a straight upgrade. This is a 1-for-1 upgrade. Someday was just a better version of Impact in 2022. I don't really see a lot of argument in that respect. Someday is going to get my coveted number 1 top laner ranking. A lot of people are going to want Summit in that role. And some people are even going to want Fudge above Someday because of the playoff performance. But I have to say, those people forget that Someday was number 2 in my MVP voting for all of the LCS last year. He was really good on 100 Thieves. They did a really good job of playing through him on that top side. And I think he kind of fits wherever he needs to. I think it is pretty clear at this point. I don't think I'm breaking any sort of mold by saying this. Someday is the greatest top laner in LCS history. I think obviously it's between him and Impact, but for me, Someday has proven at this point that there is no player that has had the consistent level of dominance in every facet of the game that Someday has had so consistently. Someday is the best laner that we have ever had in the top lane. That is something that, even though he has gotten worse at in recent years, Worse for someday means like a top 2, top 3 laner in the top lane. Just a couple of years ago, he was so far and above everybody else in that role in terms of laning that it was unfair. People have caught up a bit playing against him ideally over the past few years, but it's not like he's bad at that, and I think you can make a really strong case he is easily the best team fighter in that top lane position that we have ever seen. Obviously, those more flank-oriented team fight front-to-back picks, things like the Aatrox, those midline picks, even something like the Gangplank. He is so ridiculously good. The Gnar comes to mind. He's so ridiculously good at those champions that it's almost unfair. For me, he's going to come in at number 1. He may not have the same highs as players like Summit and as players like Fudge, but the consistency factor of what Someday offers is just invaluable. And I think adding that onto a team that plays super aggressive like Inspired and JoJo, I think he is just going to be a straight upgrade to what Impact was offering you last year. Then you look at Inspired and JoJo as the mid-jungle duo. Still probably the best mid-jungle duo in the league here. Inspired won MVP last year for a good reason. He was my choice as well. Absolutely deserved it. He's going to come in as my number 2 jungler just because I love Blabber. But Inspired is ludicrously good. I mean, genuinely ludicrously good. He's going to come in above Pyosik. Both of them coming in above Pyosik, even though he just won a world championship. I know that's going to be controversial to some people, but Inspired just plays everything super well. I think he's great at these invading type of junglers. Obviously, it's been a little bit nerfed over the offseason, but it's great because he also loves to skirmish in the river. He's basically the best at that outside of Blabber in the entire region, and he's also really good at playing facilitators. I think it's almost underrated how good he is at champions like Sejuani, where he really was able to create a huge difference for this team throughout a lot of the regular season last year. I think by the time they got to playoffs, they felt they needed to play through him just a tad bit more because Danny was gone, and I do think that hurt his performance because I do think at his core, he is somebody who does want to enable his mid laner or at least play aggressive with his mid laner, and I don't think he was really able to do that a lot throughout the playoffs, and I think we're going to get back to seeing a better version of Inspired once we jump back into the regular season here, but a big reason I feel like that is because you're pairing him up with JoJo, and this could be the year. I truly do believe last year was kind of just a preview of what JoJo Pune is capable of. If he ends up being easily the best mid in the entire region by the end of the year, I'm not going to be surprised. I've been talking about it. He's got the talent. He's got the mentality. He's got the teammates around him that can push him forward to do that. JoJo is so fantastic. He's going to come in at number 3 here, just behind Vikla, just behind Bjergsen, but his upside, in my opinion, is higher than both of those players. I think there is a real case that by the end of the year, JoJo is the number 1 mid laner in the region, and I think a lot of that has, that's a big reason why I have Evil Genius as a number 1. It's this mid-jungle duo I just still think is the best in the entire region, and I think accentuating that with a more consistent player in the top lane, and arguably a more consistent bot lane, is only going to make this team better. A lot more pressure is going to be given on this mid-jungle duo, but I have faith that they're going to step up. That's when you get to this bot lane. You're looking at FBI coming in, replacing Danny and Cowrie, kind of the duo that was playing a lot for EG last year. Danny played most of the year. Cowrie came in the playoffs, and then, of course, played at Worlds. FBI is not Danny. He's not the kind of player that is going to potentially destroy lane and then dominate these team fights. I mean, you could talk about Danny just being the best team fighter that we've seen at that AD carry position in a long time. He can turn games that are down 4 or 5k gold into, 4 or 5k gold wins for Evil Geniuses by himself. FBI isn't that player, but you're also going to get a ridiculous amount of consistency from FBI that you just did not get out of Danny. We saw some games last year where Danny was going to play super aggressive in the early game, even in the late game, and just get caught, sometimes get punished for it. FBI doesn't play like that. He's going to be really, really solid. He's going to be up 10, 15, 20 CS in pretty much every matchup that he is in. He's going to be willing to play weak side. He's going to be willing to play strong side, and he's going to be really dominant in team fights as well. While he may not have the same kind of highs as a player like Danny had, I honestly think FBI might just be better for this team. It allows more room for players like Inspired and JoJo to get a ton of those resources and play super aggressive because they don't have to worry about protecting Danny in the bot lane, kind of like they did a little bit last year where they played through bot lane a ton in the regular season. So I actually like the addition of FBI, even if I do think, like, on paper, he's a slightly worse player, right? And then you've got Vulcan. I already made the argument that Vulcan could be the best support in the entire region. I don't have him quite there yet just because I love core, but really they're equal to me. Vulcan was stellar last year. He was easily the best support in North America over the course of last year. Whether it was with Danny or with Cowrie, he proved that no matter who the AD carry is, he is going to make them look better, and I think that will be the case for FBI as well. Vulcan is incredibly versatile. He's great in the lane 2v2, which I think FBI really has struggled to take advantage of in recent years, but that's mostly because I think Huki has been on big roam duty, and I think FBI maybe getting back to playing this more lane-oriented style that he was kind of known for when he was coming up through Golden Guardians could be super beneficial to him as a player. But, you know, Vulcan can also roam if you want to play FBI on weak side, if you want to just snowball the shit out of Inspired or JoJo or whoever, right? You can have Vulcan just sit in those lanes. I mean, he did that fantastically last year when Cowrie was doing a really good job of playing weak side in the playoffs. And so I just really love the construction of this Evil Geniuses team. I think on paper, they may not have the best star talent. You know, they may not have the same kind of star talent that Prince is for FlyQuest or that Blabber is for Cloud9. But I think when you look at the complete package that Evil Geniuses is here, I think they are more complete than any other team in the LCS, and I can easily see a path where they are just the best team cohesion-wise and playstyle-wise out of everybody in the LCS in 2023. I really, really do like the construction of this team, and at this point, I'm really just hoping that they can bring it together and prove me right when it comes to that regard. All right, that is going to do it for my 2023 Spring Split LCS Power Rankings video, my 5th and final Power Rankings video in the preseason here. I really appreciate you guys watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead and leave it a like. It really does mean a lot. This is the final Power Rankings video. You guys have been killing it with both likes and comments and everything as we go throughout these series. I've said it before, I'll say it again. These are probably my favorite videos to make. I just get to talk about the league as a whole rather than individual microcosms, and it's really, really fun to get a little bit of a long platform to talk about it. So if you did enjoy it, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot for the channel. And of course, let me know down in the comment section below where I am too high on a player, where I'm too low on a player, where I'm too high on a team, maybe where I'm too low on a team. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions. Of course, just be civil. It's a conversation, not a shouting match down in the comment section below. And I really hope you guys did enjoy. Of course, if you are new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be putting out weekly review content, not only for the LCS, but for all 4 major regions, as well as the NACL. So if you're interested in that, you know, hit subscribe and stick around. It's going to be a lot of fun. People seem to enjoy those videos as well. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.